So I began the research into this book by poking through secret police archives. And by the way, they're available. You can poke through them too. The secret police trove is now at the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal. It was stored in the Bastille archive. And I was really interested in the question of how the state acts on the body. Like why the state says you can do some things with your body, but you can't do other things with your body. And an example would be that the state did not allow people to have sex some ways with each other until quite recently. So these questions are really interesting to me. And so I was sort of going through the secret police archives looking for a topic, and I stumbled across this trove. I mean, I wasn't the first person to find it, but I was sort of the first person to really explore it, of documents where the secret police were following women who were mistresses to men of the elite. And they followed them from about late 1740s through to the 1770s and wrote down everything they did. And I found this and I was like, fantastic! Like I had this horrible fear that I was going to write my book on sheep weight or the size of grass blades or something horribly boring to me. But no, I had these great stories of these women and everything that they were doing and the questions about the police and why they were doing all this. So this was really fantastic. But as I read through the documents, the more legible ones more quickly, the more illegible ones with a lot of whiskey, as I read through them, certain questions emerged, and particularly the question of agency or power. These women were denigrated and ostracized and the subject of social opprobrium, and they were wealthy and they had some power. And I was interested, like, to what degree were they able to make decisions about their lives? To what degree were they able to exercise power over their daily lives and over that of others? And this is, as I'll talk later, this is an historical question, but it's also a present question. If you follow the news, you know that there's sort of two big, all those people that follow prostitution news, like we have a group of three, but you know that there's this sort of bill working, it just came through the Senate, and there's the Dominique Strauss-Kahn affair, and if you read the coverage, this question of how much choice and power prostitutes have is really sort of a pressing present issue. Well, because I'm an historian, I can't possibly start in the present, because that wouldn't make any sense. So I will discuss the question of elite prostitution to agency in the past and in the present, and I start with the past. With the story of a woman named Anne Michalay. She lived in the middle of the 18th century. I pulled this story out of her police dossier and confirmed it to the degree that I could in other documents. Now, Anne Michalay wasn't important enough to have her own portrait painted, so we're going to have some stand-ins for her, so you have something to look at, and so there's a sense. This was not Anne Michalay. This was Marie-Madeleine Guimard, who was a famous ballerina, and in fact, one of the most highly paid elite prostitutes of her day. Fragonard painted her. She had a glorious hotel. She was the bomb. And we're just going to use her picture instead because, it's that or nothing. All right. In 1744, when she was can everyone hear me? Because I see these and they're at my eyeballs, and that's fine with me. But okay. Because that's where I talk from. In 1744, when she was 14 years old, Anne Michalay left the small town where she had grown up in the north of France, and she traveled to Paris to find work. And I always like to kind of give, this is what it looked like. She left her father, the local school teacher with whom she lived alone, her mother having died some years before. Thanks to an aunt, Anne Michalay found work in the capital as servant to a hat maker. Hatter's workshop. In this period, artisans and their families lived in their workshops, and hence their servants, and in this case, engaged equally in domestic and industrial labor. So Anne's jobs would have included domestic drudgery, fetching water, washing, firewood, lighting fires, but also removing the fur from animal pelts after they had been soaked in a mercury solution. So think about that for a few minutes. So you can see some of the processes. This picture is from the encyclopedia. It's at the hatter's workshop. The loose fur would then be processed into felt, which the hat maker used to make hats. And, like thousands of other industrial workers, risked heavy metal poisoning. They're all female, all these people that were stripping the fur from the pelts. And so you must know Mad Hatter, right, Alice in Wonderland, which I see there's a huge exhibit back there, so there are possibly some hatters in sight. But that comes from the heavy metals that hatters use to make hats. Now, perhaps it was for this reason that she left the hat maker and came to share a room with a friend with whom she worked en linge, that's sewing linen products, so like napkins and undergarments and that stuff. Now, at this point, there's nothing remarkable about her journey. Girls from her background, those who were from families that were so poor they couldn't provide a dowry, left home at the age of 12, between 12 and 14, to find work in order to earn their own dowries. Nor was changing jobs any sort of red flag. It was really common among those women engaged in low skill work. So for Anne Michalay, success at this point would not have been measured by employment stability, but rather by two other things. The first would be maintaining her sexual honor, so not having sex, or at least not having anyone know she had sex, because that's actually more important, and saving enough money for a dowry. Now, if Anne had stayed steadily employed and had been very lucky, so she hadn't been attacked, she hadn't gotten sick, she hadn't been cheated, very lucky, she might have saved 100 livres by the time she was ready for marriage, which was about the age of 25 or 26. Anne, however, was not successful, at least not in these terms. She never finished the cycle of working and saving that was supposed to lead to marriage. Midway through, at about the age of 19, she made a decision that opened the way to a different course for her, to a different future. So as a result, 12 years after leaving home, she wasn't the wife of the butcher or the baker, and I have to say it, the candlestick maker. These would have been a normal progression for her, like domestic, save money, marry an artisan, become the wife of the artisan. This was a usual match. Instead, she was a professional mistress, maintained by a Flemish marquis at the price of 500 livres a month. So in other words, in a month she would make 5 times what it would have taken her about 12 years to save. So it's a phenomenal amount of money. Though being a mistress, and the term used in the period was dame entretenue or femme entretenue, my lovely accent, or literally kept woman, was the occupation of at least 1,000 women in mid-18th century Paris. And they literally made their livings by providing sexual and companionate services to men of the elite in exchange for money and help setting up a household. So that might mean actually renting an apartment, paying servants' wages, paying grocery bills, furnishing the apartment. It sort of depended. The mistress was a professional elite sex worker. Except for those who were in the theater, and I can talk about that later if you're interested, this was their income. Being kept was what they did. And they just went from patron to patron to patron. It's not like, oh, I really like this guy, let me give this a shot, oh, that didn't work out, I'm going to go back to being, in hat making, because that was so awesome. No, they literally would go from patron to patron. And their relations with patrons were actually governed by a very formal type of oral contract, which stipulated remuneration very, very specifically. So for these women, it wasn't a question of personal attachment. Mistresses moved from patron to patron, taking advantage of better contracts, trying to find a man who paid more, bothered them less, or for any other reason was a more desirable employer. Many of these mistresses had boyfriends, some had husbands, so they would use their earnings from sex work to support a private, intimate life. All right, so the obvious question is, what happened? How do you go from being this daughter of a school teacher to a well-established, well-paid, kept woman? Well, I'm not sure, but I will tell you the story and we can all decide. So Anne's turn toward prostitution, we see in retrospect, began when she left her furnished room to live with a 26-year-old man named Vilbin. He was a soldier in the Black Musketeers, and the police inspector who's writing all this down, he's mean, and he's funny, and he describes people in very concise, horrible ways. So he describes Vilbin as very ugly. So the couple shared an apartment for 2 years in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, which was a working-class part of Paris, and they passed for man and wife. Now, I don't know if they tried to do that or everybody just assumed they were man and wife, but they passed for man and wife. They had a daughter, a little girl. Everything changed, however, in the summer of 1752. Vilbin left Paris to visit his family, and he abandoned Anne. Anne, this is what we know from her police record, then worked as a prostitute to support herself. First she worked in some high-end brothels, and then she worked as a streetwalker, and she was arrested and incarcerated. This was the famous women's prison, which I know is, I guess, the Great Hospital. which I find endlessly amusing. But anyway, she was imprisoned not because she was streetwalking, but because she was doing it as a man. She was dressed as a man while she was doing it, and that was intolerable to the police at the time. Streetwalking was bad enough, but cross-dressing streetwalking was sort of fraud and all these other things. Okay, so she was arrested and incarcerated for 8 months, and we're given very little explanation for what seemed like such a dramatic shift in her behavior. So why prostitution and not domestic service? Or why prostitution and not going back to working with linens? Was it the best option? Was it the only option? Now the next bit is kind of odd, so I'm going to give you a direct translation, and I realized just now I could have just given you the direct French, but I have the English, so bear with me. Okay, so Velbin, on returning to Paris and learning of Anne's conduct during his absence, no longer wanted to support the cost of her household by himself, so he had passades with her like many others. Now a passade was when a client paid a prostitute to spend an entire night with her. Next, Velbin introduces Anne to a magistrate, Pierre de Tourmont, who usually kept a mistress and was looking for a new one. Now Velbin went from a common law husband to a paying customer to a pimp, challenges the earlier part of the police's narrative. It suggests that rather than being Anne's boyfriend, he had in fact been her patron and she his mistress, making her turn to the brothels and streetwalking not all that surprising. Whatever the case, Tourmont, fantastic career move for Anne. He was a well-known figure in the world of elite prostitution, and being with him marked Anne as a professional kept woman and gave her access to other candidates for patronage. And so the police then traced a lucrative career. And next became the mistress to a prince who gave her 600 livres a month, which was about the average salary for mistresses at mid-century. And he also gave her, so let me give you a sense of how much money this was for someone from Anne's background. Now, if Anne had worked for a seamstress, not as a seamstress, but for a seamstress, and this would have been a very good job, she would have been paid between 36 and 100 livres a year. If she had been a shop girl, and her job was to work at these fashion shops where people would bring in their dresses and have these women sew doodads on them to update them, because dresses are extremely expensive and hard to make, so rather than getting a new dress, you just took your old dress to the fashion shop and had it updated with the newest whatever, peacock feathers or I don't know. So if that had been her job, she might have earned between 150 and 200 livres a year. Instead, she was earning 600 a month. The prince also gave Anne 6,000 livres of furniture, which was more than most nobles spent to furnish their homes. The prince was followed by a number of other wealthy men and acquired a carriage, which is an extreme mark of wealth, an extensive wardrobe, again, clothes are very expensive. The last we hear of her is 1756, she's 27, so she's nearing the end of the age of retirement for most kept women. She's still pulling in high fees for mistress work. Her daughter's 6, and they live together, meaning that Anne was head of her own household. The police inspector, who was following Anne's career, writing regular reports on her, claimed, Anne Michalay liked to play the wit and everyone pretended that she was. Again, nasty. Okay, so the story raises several questions. Why? We kind of get a sense of her trajectory. The question now is why? Why did she become an elite prostitute? But just as important, and this is the question I'm most interested in, given her earnings, what did her prostitution mean? Did her wealth allow for more personal freedom than she would have had she married the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker? Or did social stigma outweigh any possible gains that the wealth could have realized? In other words, for Anne, what was the relationship of her prostitution to her agency? Now, as I mentioned, this isn't just an historical question. I might even say that it's hardly an historical question. It's not like there's 10,000 people looking at prostitution, which is good, I guess. I don't know. Leaves more room for me. But it's really, the subject tends to come up in response to contemporary debates around prostitution. So to give one example right here, 2 weeks ago, the French Senate passed a bill contre le système prostitutionnel that has been bouncing around Parliament in various forms since 2010. In 2012, the then Minister for Women's Rights gave the motion a big push when she publicly announced her party's goal of abolishing prostitution. And there were protests. I don't know if anyone was here and saw them, but there are protests by sex workers across France. When the bill which actually proposed criminalizing the purchase of sex, passed the National Assembly in 2013. There was a huge hullabaloo in the press. All these major intellectuals were weighing in. It was hugely controversial. Most of the major parties, dozens of social welfare and women's rights organizations, some feminist intellectuals supported the proposal. Sex worker unions, some men's groups, other feminist intellectuals opposed the bill. And it actually was defeated, and then it just passed the Senate again 2 weeks ago, but was changed radically. So it's still an ongoing issue. The abolitionists, echoing arguments that have been made through Europe and America forever, like since the 19th century, claim that all prostitution is coerced. And they cite these really powerful studies that show that most prostitutes are trafficked, or they end up in prostitution because they're drug addicts, or they were horribly abused as children, and consequently they really have no other choice. This is exactly the life that they're going to lead. There's not really a lot of other options. They have no agency. The opposition says, you know what, you're interviewing people in shelters, you're interviewing people in prison. Of course you're going to get a subgroup that represents this. But for us, they argue, prostitution is a profession. Le Monde likes to interview these women a lot. Prostitution is a profession, we pay our taxes, we pay our bills. I've been here for 40 years. And they assert vociferously even that they're not victims. They consider themselves, some even consider themselves rebels, taking the stand that in owning their own sexuality and using it as they wish, they subvert patriarchy. Not surprisingly, this is a claim abolitionists, feminists refute. In their view, all prostitutes are exploited because basically they're in a system where they're only valued for the pleasure they provide. So it's all agency, right? You have no agency. No, I have agency. No, you don't. So that's I would be like fired from my job if someone knew I was taking this complicated thing and reducing it down to like one line, but I did it, so don't tell anyone. All right, anyway, so it makes sense at this point to stop talking about prostitutes as a group and to disaggregate them. The protesters and members of sex worker unions are usually not trafficked into prostitution. They're usually not beholden to pimps and gangs. They mostly work for themselves, and should they be able to find other employment, can quit at any time. Now, popular culture disaggregates prostitutes differently, opposing elite prostitutes or call girls to streetwalkers. Film, except for Pretty Woman, but film, TV, and fiction, and even journalistic treatments tend to assume that streetwalkers are desperate. This is especially the case in the US, while call girls are not. So I have my handy graphics. So think Fantine, like what, I sold my body, then I sold my hair, I think I sold my teeth, and then I had to check I don't know, someone called and I stopped at that point in the movie and I don't know what else happened to her, but I know she died, just bad. Versus Belle. This was a character, the central character in a Showtime series called The Secret Diary of a Call Girl. And you can look at her, she's like, oh, prostitution's so easy, my dress is actually coming off on its own, and I can take all my money and buy things that look expensive, and it's a whole different, I sold everything, I'm about to die, I like shopping, like very different views of, of prostitution. So anyway, so Belle, in the show, actually says because she likes sex and money, prostitution was an obvious career choice for her. And when I heard that, I jumped up and started yelling. I'm like, that's an 18th century trope, but they didn't care. But I care. But the 18th century writers about prostitution would say, oh yes, these women are elite prostitutes because they like sex and they like money and they're too lazy to do other things. So it's an old trope. Is anybody get the lights? I'm having trouble seeing what I'm reading. Charles, is there any way you can turn the lights on?
Yeah.
Okay.
For everyone.
Okay, yeah. Now, further empowering, Belle's secret history reveals her to be a feminist. She says, I've read every feminist book. They show her reading, The Second Sex and all these things. And a wealthy one, and she uses her income to buy this very posh townhouse in London. Thank you. Now, the series was based on a blog and then a book by a woman who later revealed herself to be Dr. Brookman-Genti, a developmental neurotoxicologist who spent 14 months in grad school earning the equivalent of $650 an hour for sex. Now, she gave an interview to The Guardian, and in it she claimed she couldn't find a job in her field because she was still a graduate student, and she needed money, and she earned more this way than any other, and she had no regrets. It's comfortable opposition for us, right? Elite prostitution is simply the best choice for some women, with a host of choices for the most empowered women among us. Because perhaps, like Belle, they're not merely making money, they're embracing their own sexuality. They're liberated in a way the audience is not, which makes it okay for the audience to watch Belle week after week having sex with her customers. In fact, in doing so, maybe you're supporting women's emancipation, or just Showtime, I don't know. But the opposition is false. Most of those who've been protesting in France are not graduate students, they're not college educated, and as the trial of Dominique Strauss-Kahn is very clearly made very clear, not every call girl had a happy childhood or is being paid $650 an hour to have sex with well-mannered, attractive men. So this opposition is completely false. All right, I'm going to get that off because no one's going to listen to me. There we go. Oh, that's even better. Okay, so here's our next stand-in for Anne Michalay. This was Louise O'Murphy. It's a portrait by Boucher. When she was 14, we believe she was the mistress of Louis XV, yeah. And she must have been older than 14 in this picture, but there we go. Okay, so let's turn back now to Anne Michalay and totally change the parameters of our discussion. Because any discussion of prostitution and agency in the 18th century is going to be completely different than it is for now. And this is the case for many reasons, but I'm going to pick two. First, engaging in prostitution had very different consequences. You couldn't just do it like Dr. Mangenti did and then go on and become a developmental neurotoxicologist. Not sure what that is, but it sounds really important. And it dishonored women completely. Without sexual honor, it's very hard to find work. And without sexual honor, it was very hard to marry. If you didn't marry, it's not like you could just be the single girl. It was very difficult to financially support oneself. One had almost no social standing. I mean, it was a really difficult life. Single women in the 18th century were in a bad way. Secondly, and this is something I find really interesting, the choice coercion formula, it doesn't work in the 18th century. Like, we tend to oppose choice and coercion, right? I had a choice versus I was coerced. Now, some girls in the 18th century were trafficked into prostitution, but many, many, many more were forced into marriages from which they could not escape. Overall, the constraints faced by women, and indeed most men in this period, were already so numerous that very few had a great deal of choice. This idea, I don't know if you've said this to young people in your life, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? My son today said a logger. He's 4, there's time. That just didn't exist. That just wasn't a concept. Instead, a child's future was dictated by family need and opportunity. Hence, he's going to be a surgeon. But anyway, that's so. Just saying. Okay. Now, less choice, and this is important, didn't mean less happiness, right? That's another part of a modern imaginary. But sometimes it did, and this was definitely the case when people were forced into marriages they didn't want to be in, low status and dangerous jobs. So when Anne came to Paris, she had no choice but to take the job her aunt had found for her. Employment required connections. You just didn't go to the paper or bring your, I don't know, you don't have a resume, but there's just no other way to find a job. You had to know people. So Anne had to spend her days covered in mercury. If she had moved to Lyon, the silk capital of France, she would have been part of an industrial, most likely, army of women who spent 15 hours a day pulling silk from the cocoons of mulberry worms, and this process involved being wet all the time. These women contracted tuberculosis at an alarming rate, and they had very high mortality. And that's actually not so bad compared to what happened to women in mining, what happened to women who worked in dye yards. Women were the industrial back of the early modern industrial revolution. They did the worst and the hardest sort of labor. That's another book, but I talk about that too. Were these jobs better or worse than prostitution? In some instances, they were more dangerous and less lucrative, and only marginally more respectable. Women did not turn to prostitution because it was the only option, but often because it was the best option. Under these conditions, coercion does not carry its modern connotation as the antithesis of freedom, but rather it's just part of the fabric of 18th century life. Okay, so, I need some water, sorry. Whether prostitution was Anne's only choice or Anne's best choice, we cannot pretend that it was anything but a really, really bad choice. Street walking, or worse, being incarcerated, disabled Anne socially. That was it. Like, she could not sort of make way after that. With such a history, she couldn't find work, she would have had trouble marrying, and she would have almost no option but to return to the streets. If Anne became a prostitute because she had little agency, being a streetwalker decreased it further still. But that's not the end. We have to ask what happened next. What happened once Anne became the mistress to Tourmont and she started earning 500-600 livres a month? When she started to earn serious money. Was Anne and women like her, were they able to translate their financial freedom into other kinds of freedoms that were unusual for women from such backgrounds? So the way that there's no easy way to answer this, so I decided to compare Anne's life to that of an ideal baker's wife, not a specific baker's wife. So here we have some. So a baker's wife would not have been baking. She would have been managing the bakery, selling the goods, handling deliveries, handling the cash. The bakery might have been a one-oven operation. It might have been something as big as this. And a lot of these pictures are from, not this one, but they're from the Encyclopédie. Do you like my different capitalization schemes? That's yeah, very well done there. Okay, so let's compare. Now, Anne earned more as a mistress than she would have, most likely, in a decade as a baker's wife. So we'll start with money and lifestyle, right? Her lifestyle was considerably more grand. She had a bigger apartment in a more glamorous neighborhood. Now, when I looked at a sample of 100 of these sort of contracts between patron and mistress as reported by the police, I found that at least half of the kept women lived in apartments that they rented between 400 and 700 livres a year. Only 10% of Parisians lived in apartments that cost that much. Most lived in apartments that were between 42 and 200. So Anne's apartment was pretty posh. Kept women furnished their apartments nicely or luxuriously if they could afford it. And this was critical. Mistresses were very into furniture. They got their patrons to buy them new furniture. I just grabbed this from the Carnavalet website because I don't know if it's coming out, it's just really beautiful. They wanted the most up-to-date, fashionable furniture around. They just loved furniture. And it really marked the difference between them and streetwalkers. I have permanence, I have furniture. Anne would have slept under silk covers, the baker's wife under wool. Anne and other kept women had substantial wardrobes and numerous garments that they regularly took to fashion shops. These outfits had to be glamorous. Baker's wife, probably, plain, probably a little less plain than that. And Anne would have had extensive jewelry. Okay, power. Professional mistresses were unusual figures for a period in which the state exercised control by making sure everybody had their spot under somebody else. So husbands controlled wives, in theory, parents, children, we all know that's a theory, masters, servants, and apprentices, and teachers, students. The baker's wife would have been under, I'm quoting here, the government of her husband. The baker himself would have been under the government of the guild under the government of the police, who were under the minister of the interior, under the king, under God, etc. Everyone had their place, except kept women. As a child, Anne was under her father. When she moved to Paris and became a servant, she was under her employer. When she was out on the street as a streetwalker, her independence quickly dispatched when she was arrested and incarcerated and came under the control of the state. As a kept woman, she was outside of this hierarchy. She was head of her own household. She would have signed the lease and provisioned the house and made any decisions that were necessary. Anne had a small household, just she and her daughter, but other kept women supported parents and cousins and multiple children, their own siblings. The baker's wife ran her own household and ran the bakery, but she was head of neither, not in her own eyes, nor that of her family, nor that of the law. Okay, sexual freedom, our third category. Professional mistresses had some degree of sexual freedom. Baker's wife did not. In principle, marriage compelled the wife to relinquish ownership of her sexual body to her husband in exchange for everything you get when you're married, all the benefits of marriage. And in the 18th century, they still had the idea of the marital debt, which was to keep husband and wife from sinning. Both partners had to provide sex for the other whenever the other wanted it, and so this was basic part of marriage, which meant that there was no idea of marital rape. Marital rape was just a bad marriage. It wasn't actually a concept. Elite prostitution, on the other hand, meant that the kept woman controlled her own sexual body. And the most elite among them could, in fact, pick and choose their sexual partners. So kept women then were able to exchange sex, company, affection for a household, and yet, like the fictitious Belle, retain control over their sexuality. However, I always feel like I should do this. However, When discussing elite prostitutes, we should not exaggerate the extent of their agency. In principle, they control their sexual bodies, but economic necessity made that kind of rare. A woman could rarely say no to a patron, and if so, she could rarely say no for long. In the best of circumstances, a kept woman could decide who to take on as a client, but not whether or not to sleep with anyone at all. Like, she couldn't get out. And while these women headed their own households, they were subject to the whim of their patrons. If a patron wished to beat or incarcerate his mistress, there was nothing she could do. And the police did nothing. Like, they would report, you know, Marquis de so-and-so or Comte de so-and-so is beating his mistress and keeping her locked in his house. Then they would go to the next entry. It's like, dude, you know, do something. But they just had no interest in intervening in this world. In contrast, the financial and social protections afforded a wife were inscribed in law, and they were enforced. Her property was protected. A husband who spent his wife's money or brutalized her would be stopped through legal proceedings. I've been reading a lot of these cases now, so I tell you it did happen. Kept women had no such protection. The contract which governed patron-mistress relations, the one which determined how much Anne would be paid, was voluntary. Compliance was voluntary. So if the prince or Tourmont stopped paying Anne's monthly salary, her only recourse was to leave him. And in fact, this was the most common excuse for breakups. If the prince wanted to take back that 6,000 livres of furniture, he could. Anne wouldn't have been able, it would have been pretty tough for her to reclaim it. The fact is, very few patrons beat their mistresses. Some did, but few did. Very few tried to take back items. But the fact that they could highlights the vulnerability of these women. And while Anne had 6,000 livres of debt, she also, furniture, she had staggering debt. This just blows me away. She was being paid 600 livres a month, but she had to hawk her earrings to pay other debts. Her next patron gave her 300 livres to get the earrings back. Now, part of this world was, these women were caught up in commodity culture. We can go back to the picture of Belle with all her bags and her dress that's flying away. They were caught up in commodity culture. I always think like shiny, shiny, but it's actually, there's a little more to it than that. The more stuff they had that looked valuable, the higher they could sell themselves for, the more they appeared to be worth. So there's sort of a market issue here. The more stuff, the shinier the stuff, the higher the sexual capital of a kept woman, the more she could demand for her services. It was a really hard balancing act to accomplish. Now, the baker's wife had debt too. Everybody had debt. I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming we all have debt. You know, house, car, whatever. Debt is endemic to society. In the 18th century, though, debt had a different purpose. It embedded sort of business people in communities. They would be equally owed and owing. It's sort of odd. It's not like someone's a debtor or a debtee. So the baker's wife would have been caught in this network of debt that would have really situated her comfortably in her community. And she would not have hawked the flower shipment to buy a new dress. Like, you know, the debts made sense. They were part of the business arrangement. Okay, our last category, long-term security. Now, while relentless acquisition of luxury items was characteristic of the demi-monde, it threatened the financial well-being of kept women, who basically could work no more than 10 years. They had little long-term security. Now, some were very good money managers. And when their patrons said, oh, what can I give you? They would say, an annuity, please. And this actually was great because it was a notarized document. Nobody could take it back. It was theirs. It generated income until the French Revolution. Then it didn't. But most of these women were not great money managers. And when many of them reached their late 20s or early 30s, their choices were truly grim. Truly grim. Some actually married. Their wealth or celebrity overcoming the social disadvantage of their prostitution. Those who managed their wealth often opened their own fashion shops or became madams. But for many others, and unfortunately these people disappear, so like the police stop paying attention to them, so I can't really tell you the end of the story. So satisfying. But they had no choice but to continue selling sex, and their desirability, their sexual capital decreased as they aged. So they moved down the prostitution hierarchy to street walking, which is incredibly dangerous. It's dangerous because of exposure, disease, violence. So while kept women may have been able to exercise sexual and other forms of agency, for a period in their careers, this was impossible for most when their careers ended. Okay, baker's wife. Barring disaster, had financial security into old age, or as much as anyone could have. She would have run the bakery when her husband died, and it's most likely she would have outlived him. She could have run it alone, depending on where she lived, or married a journeyman and ran it together. When she was ready to retire, and again, it depended where she lived, but in most places, she would have had a legal entitlement to a certain percentage of the earnings, so until her death. So for kept women, long-term prospects were not great. Yet, and again, this is keep going back and forth, for a decade in their lives, sometimes more, women who otherwise would have been streetwalkers, dying young, on the streets or in prison, were able to exercise a modicum of choice in their sexual partners, and in doing so were able to support themselves. The cost was social respectability, but the benefit, beyond food on the table and a luxurious place to sleep, was a chance at a future. The future did not encompass a reintegration into the artisanal world from which these women came, but held out the possibility of a place, as a madam, a dress shop owner, or a wife. Is this how Anne Michalay ended her days? We don't know, but we can only hope. Yes, I have a chapter on this. This is really, really amazing. So there's always the first patron, right? The primary patron, and he would have the contract, and they would stick to the terms of the contract. And then she would often have a second patron who she would see on the side, right? And he might have a contract, he might not. And then she might sell sex like here and there for a night or two. And then she might have a boyfriend. And the primary patron would often be completely intolerant of this, know about it, and pretend he wasn't seeing it, and then suddenly notice it because he wanted to break up with her and go with someone else. But it's this entire sort of economy, you know, of like hoodwinking that's really interesting, and who had more power, like the boyfriend with whom she's sharing all this, or so yeah. But if the primary patron is paying very little, he might agree that she'll take someone else. So it just depends. It's sort of at a granular level, but yeah, I think that is a form of resistance that I find really interesting. Mainly through the police records, and then there's some, you can use notarial records, they're mentioned in memoirs, they write their own letters. I mean, the first chapter of the book is why I think you can use these records as a source when they're compromised in the way that they are. And so it's mainly that, then just there's brothel records, and there are other police records from other police departments that you can read against these. So it's mainly judicial, but it's almost impossible to write about prostitution before the 19th century without writing about it through the judicial angle, which is why almost all books on prostitution until the last 15 years were on punishment and discipline and ways to kind of keep these women under control, and none of them are about who these women are and what their lives are like, because it's a risk, right? You're using the very documents that are meant to, circumscribe their lives, that are meant to control them, as a way to figure out who they are. So automatically they're compromised. So it's a really hard historical project, but it's sort of becoming of age now. They're like double-sided. The first part of that, I can say that there are at least 1,000 men in the police records, but in this period, figuring out who's what, like who's really a noble and who's not a noble, is so difficult. So I can't say what percentage, but there's a very strong libertine culture. Okay, but I can answer the second one, which is that some men would flaunt their mistresses. And in fact, when a mistress would go across the stage, this audience was supposed to scream her patron's name, and this was a form of status, right? And she would wear his jewels, and she would make her proclamations of love, not to her fellow actor or singer, but to her patron. And others would hide. And my favorite case, and this is not known, is the Marquis de Sade. If you know his story, you know his mother-in-law was ferociously conservative and had him locked up all the time. Her husband was having an affair and was stealing her jewels and her money to pay for his mistress. So he hid it all the time, otherwise. So men would flaunt it as part of status. And they would hide it because they would get in trouble if it was found out. But some of them hid it for reasons I can't figure out. And that's partially why I wanted to write the second book. Like, I'm trying to figure out, more generally, sexual culture. Like, why is it that this is okay for some groups and not for other groups? And everything I've looked at, like religion, how long your family's been ennobled, where you're from, doesn't explain it enough. So I'm really curious to why some hid it and some flaunted it. Thank you. This has been interesting. Yeah.